Paris Perspective.
And you're very welcome to this edition of Paris Perspective. And today we're going to look at events and repercussions coming from the US and how they are being felt around the world. And that is, of course, looking back to the killing of George Floyd, who is a black man who was apparently suffocated after being pinned to the ground by the Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin for over 9 minutes back on the 25th of May 2020. And that has highlighted the abuse faced by black people and other ethnic minorities in the United States. Now, the impact of Floyd's death and subsequent trial of Officer Chauvin has resonated across the globe as countries take stock of the uncomfortable truth of endemic inequality, police brutality, and racial profiling within their own communities. Now, today we're going to discuss social exclusion, racism, discrimination here in France. We're going to look at some of the cases of death in police custody and that also echo the injustices highlighted by the Black Lives Matter movement, and France's approach to reconciling the pillars of liberty, equality and fraternity, while also tackling allegations of institutional discrimination. Today, I'm joined by Professor Curtis Young, who's come all the way from Angers to join us today. Thank you very much for coming up on the train today.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, David.
Well, Curtis, I mean, again, before we started recording today, it was like, well, where do we start? So, do we go back to 1619? Do we go back to 1865? Do we go back to 1964, 68? Today, I mentioned 1992, Rodney King, the LA riots. But first, I just want to ask, let's just say, a global question. Let's bring France into the limelight here. In your opinion, is the problem of police brutality or excessive force or use of force by the authorities as racially targeted in France as it would appear to be in the United States?
Yes.
Unequivocally.
Yeah, that's the short answer. This racializing, this construction of the other, and in France in America it's the African American. Right now, it's also the Asian American. There has been a construction of an other from the beginning of the American project. This construction of an other is also part of the colonial project that Europe was engaged in since the 19th century. France colonized all of West Africa. That was how do you do that? Well, part of it is you construct a narrative of another, which gives you then the license to do as you will. Okay, so that construction of another is a narrative that continues to resonate through our daily lives in France. And so when the policeman has a choice of, am I going to look at this person or that person? When I go walk through the streets of Paris, for example, I oftentimes see policemen controlling, that is, questioning a young black man. I have never, in the 15 years I've lived in this country, where I've lived in the 18th arrondissement, the 17th arrondissement, the 3rd arrondissement, now I'm in the 14th arrondissement, I spend a lot of time in the streets of Paris. I have never in 15 years seen a policeman controlling a white kid.
Well, it's interesting you say that. There was a report that came out in 2017 from the rights defender that found that 18 to 25-year-olds, now this is just an age demographic, 18 to 25-year-olds in general were stopped 7 times more for ID checks. And if they were black or Arab or North African descent, yet again, racial profiling here, they were stopped more than 5 times. So basically, if you are black or Arab, and between the 18 to 25 demographic, it seems like an exponential chance that you are going to be, controlled, as they would say in French, for your ID.
Yeah.
But would it not be though right in saying, and this is not in any way being an apologist, but in France, is the discrimination that people would feel in that demographic, is that not more of a socioeconomic discrimination rather than a racially targeted or racially motivated type of discrimination?
Well, in terms of the various categories, I think that the overriding identifier is the color of the skin. There are poor kids across the demographic spectrum. But why is it that this idea that, because there's an assumption, there's an assumption, if it's a black kid, he's probably doing something wrong. He's probably up to something. He's probably, let's check this out. While dozens of other kids walk by.
Yeah.
But there's this target. I have a good friend of mine. He's in his 70s. He's French. He's Jewish. When he left France when he was 16 years old because he was tired of being stopped by the police, slapped around, and then once they looked at his identification, said, "Oh, we apologize. We thought you were using a slur for a North African," and they would salute him, and my friend would be on his way. Gotcha. Do you see what I mean?
Well, there's an interesting thing. I mean, on that idea, I mean, there are agencies, NGOs that are really trying to get to tackle racial profiling. In January of this year, there were 6 NGOs that filed a class action lawsuit against the French government itself, claiming systemic discrimination by the French police of racial profiling, carrying out ID checks, as you said, by either Black or North African-looking people. Now, they're not looking for any compensation here, but they are trying to get institutional reforms. So let's say, this is including groups such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. So they're not saying, they're not accusing the police themselves of being racist, but they say that they are working within a system that generates discriminatory tactics. So is that kind of doublespeak in your opinion? Is that just a little legal loophole doublespeak? Because they're saying officers are acting within a system that allows these practices to spread and become installed, but they are not calling officers out for being actually racist.
Perfect storm. There are 2 things that come into that. That's one part of it, but also I don't want to say miseducation, but the lack of an education about this idea of how do we live together as human beings. That's not something we're educated. That's something we have to be educated about. Something we have to recognize because we're educated. We're taught that there's a difference between human beings. We're taught that. It's not necessarily in textbooks in schools, but we're taught by all of the institutions that construct our ideology, our legal system, our media, our cultural system. Usually, when in a film, is the Black guy the protagonist, or is the Black guy usually in the film the marginal person? So from a very early age, we're taught there's something different about these people, and we have to keep an eye out about them. And then we grow up, and we become policemen and judges and administrators, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we bring that with us. Nobody is innocent, David. We bring this with us to the job. Now, the job in itself incorporates that, as you said. So both of these things come together. And then we're trying to work out, well, what's going on? Why is that? Because we're looking for something outside of us that we have to fix. And I think that what we all have to do, David, is turn the eye in on ourselves.
Speaking of eyes, you've led me right into my next question. The paradox of colorblindness. Turning a blind eye to the actual fact that people are of different races or of different ethnic backgrounds of different types leads then to people to be able to say, oh, well, then there's no problem. We're all equal.
There's no such thing as colorblind. How can you be blind to the fact that I'm a person of color? How can you not see this? How can I not see that you are of the ethnicity that you are? Okay,
standard Paddy.
The question is, what do I do with that?
Yeah.
Do I make a judgment about that? And what kind of a judgment do I make about that, one person against the other? So all of these siblings, this idea of colorblindness and all these kinds of things are, once again, David, they're avoiding the question. And the question is our own introspection. We can't. One of the things that's going on in America now by a media character, Tucker Carlson, in the United States, is this whole idea of the great replacement theory that he's articulating. What is the great replacement theory? This has been somehow or another, the other, blacks, immigrants are going to replace us white people. This is what's going on. This is Jean-Marie Le Pen. This has been going on, of course, for decades, where they're looking at demographics and they're looking at the Hispanification of the American or U.S. mainland. Exactly,
and
this has been going on at a certain point back in the 19th century. In America, it was the Irish that are going to replace. The Irish were considered the N-word.
A lot of them were coming in around 1845. All right. So,
1845. The revolutions in 1848 here in Europe brought Germans into America like mad, brought the Irish into America, and every one of these ethnic groups had to struggle somehow to become to fit into the American narrative. And so when they would arrive on the shores, Europeans didn't look at themselves as black and white. This is an American construction that you are black and you're white.
So it's the nativists basically who made that us and them.
Exactly. So the Irishman would arrive in America, and the guy would say, "Are you black or white?" The guy says, "I'm Irish." He says, "No. Are you like that guy pointing to a black guy? Or are you like that guy pointing to a white guy?" And that begins immediately this idea. There's a difference, and I need to pay attention to that.
Now, indeed, like France is a much older country than the USA, but I mean, in France and under the French Constitution, there's very little. How would you say? There's very little room for maneuver to actually give credence to somebody's race. It's like, oh, you're French, but you're French.
Yeah.
And like in America, you'll say, well, I mean, you will say you are an African American. I mean, you have the Native Americans say, no, look, you called us Indians. We want to be called Indians. But here in France, there's no such. I don't think of anybody saying that I'm Franco-African.
Right. There's no look. France, David, you know this better than I do. France is a Jacobin republic. Okay, this is a republic that was formed in 1792 around the idea of these Republican ideas. So everybody in France fits within the Republican construct. The good thing about this is that everybody in France, regardless of color, regardless of ethnic background, that sort of thing, participate in the same civil space. So one of the things that because America is not constructed that way, one of the things that we've been able to do is divide healthcare. For example, divide education. This is for black people. This is for white people. We had it institutionalized in our Constitution with the 1898 Plessy versus Ferguson. It said blacks can live in this country, but they have to be separate. There's no such thing as that in a republic, and so which is good. But one of the things one of the weaknesses, and it's not a weakness, one of the problematics of that idea is that it gives us it legitimizes our ability to turn our eye away from the fact of the reality of
uncomfortable
France,
truth,
which is the uncomfortable truth, is that it's made up of a lot of people who are not Gaul.
How, now, you're mentioning education there. I mean, do you have any high hopes for now that Jill Biden is the first lady and is very much a promoter of education and, like, let's just call it as it is. I mean, in America, education is looked at as a privilege and access to education has been stifled. I mean, the last Ministry for Education, I think, was an absolute joke. It was basically a job for one of the Mar-a-Lago club that was just thrown in there who had no idea. So, I mean, do you have any hopes now? I mean, not very much can be done in 4 years.
No, but, not much can be done in 4 years because one of the things we have to do is break the back of neoliberalism. Go to the arguments of Thomas Piketty and the great work he's doing on how inequality has been structured. And one of the things that has brought about the inequality that we have is the privatization of education, of our education system. So if you are wealthy or if you're from the right families, in the right neighborhoods, et cetera, you'll find your way into Harvard, Stanford, Yale, and all of the rest. And in the proper schools that will allow you to take that journey. But if you're poor, your chances of taking that journey are not so available to you. And so there's little that one administration can do to address that. Other than to begin to dismantle the neoliberal construct that has allowed our education system to become as horrible as it is.
But you need a global willingness for that to happen. I mean, the revolution will not happen overnight. I mean, it's so entrenched. I mean, what is the way forward? It's a generational thing, I would expect.
It is a generational thing, but the thing about it is it needs everybody on board. I mean, it needs the United States and France and England and all of the countries that have been in the vice of neoliberalism since Reagan, Thatcher, in the 1980s. Joe Biden is taking good steps in that direction with this stimulus package that he's put through, the largest stimulus package in American history. If he get the conversations that he's having about an infrastructure package are going a long way towards this. But when we have to dismantle this idea that prisons are a market, a product of the market.
And the privatization,
privatized prisons,
I know, it's incredible,
privatized education, privatized, you name it. So the whole idea is for the wealthy to make more, and for and the poor to continue to.
Well, I mean, it also brings me on to something, kind of looking at the situation in the U.S. and trying to compare it with maybe the situation on ground, as you say, as a Jacobin republic that we're in. One of the big issues in the United States, of course, is gerrymandering. And I mean, Biden has said, well, this really is a problem that has to be addressed. And that is, to redefine the voting map of every county and every state on a federal level. It's cited as one of the main obstacles for ethnic minorities in getting their ballots cast. I mean, that has been underlined time and time again. But is there anything along those lines comparable here in France? To the same extent that gerrymandering has affected minorities in the U.S.?
No. There's no, because there's not the context for that in France. As you mentioned at the outset, this is a very, very, very old country. When the French Revolution happened in 1789, the United States was just promulgating their first constitution. The United States had been a country for 10 years. And so we have entrenched institutions in France. We have, again, a Republican voting system in France. We don't have that in America. We have a system in America where some people, I mean, this has been all over the world, huh? Voting was first the province of people who had white men who had property could vote because they have a stake in the government.
Yes.
That's really clear. And so everybody who's not white and who's not a man who doesn't own property has had to fight for the right to vote. You know that history, how long it took women to get the right to vote, how long it took blacks to get the right to vote. And it's interesting that since the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, going back to the 19th century, this white supremacist narrative has been trying everything possible to prevent black people from voting.
Yes.
And all the steps that have been made, you mentioned the 1960s, the time of Martin Luther King and the Voting Rights Act that was passed by Lyndon Johnson in those days. Okay, you would think, that problem is solved. But today in 2021, we're dealing with Georgia, for example, the state of Georgia, which has just passed a law that's specifically designed to make it difficult for blacks and minorities to vote. Gerrymandering was designed to make it difficult for blacks and minorities to vote, to make sure that people who saw themselves as Republicans at the time when this whole gerrymandering idea started with Tom DeLay when he was in Congress back in Texas. This is one more effort to keep minorities, immigrants, et cetera, from the polls. So our histories along that are completely different, David.
Now, looking at minorities, and hopefully they are in a minority still, and that would be the extreme right. But we were discussing there that Marine Le Pen looks pretty good in the polls for the elections that are due here in France.
She's neck and neck with Macron.
With Macron for next year for the elections. But we mentioned it when we were off camera earlier about Popper's paradox. This is that intolerance can't be tolerated. Very recently, just last month in March of this year, this Génération Identitaire, this group that the Interior Minister Darmanin has said, well, they incite discrimination, hatred, violence. They have ties with white supremacist groups, and they've got branches in several European countries that show the characteristics of private militia. So this is all ringing bells. I mean, you can imagine of KKK and, even what we saw there at Capitol Hill there on the 6th of January. They claim to have about 2,800 members who are, in their view, in their very clear view of how they look at Western Europe, that they're stopping the Islamification or the Islamization of Europe. With your experience, how does one engage with people who are so entrenched in their convictions? Is it a paradox to give them a voice? This is the whole thing. This is the issue. Like you read the media saying, just because these people are doing something radical does not mean that you should hone your debate skills. They have to be taught how to listen. What do you think?
The whole idea is your freedom fighter is my terrorist, and vice versa. So what I go back to every time, David, are two things. One, humanism. We're at the end of the day, we're all the same human being, with all the same desires and dreams and wants and that sort of thing. We've created a society where people think that in order for me to be happy, you have to be out of my way. You cannot be in my life. There's room for all of us. Okay. So one of the things I think we have to begin to do really is, number one, start engaging one another on the level of our humanism. The humanity. And number two, change the language. Because one of the things that we tend to do, I remember back in 1992, my Buddhist organization put together with Johan Galtung and at Taplow Court in London, in England, outside of London, a peace journalism course. This was in 1992 during the Kosovo Wars. And the whole idea is, how do we give language that speaks to moving forward, that speaks to humanism, that speaks to peace? How do we give it the same gravitas as the language that speaks for war and violence and hatred and that sort of thing? We sort of move the language of peace over to the side of, that's soft kumbala stuff, but war and hatred and let's go, that sort of thing. And
it's kind of like the culture wars with people being woke and they're being lambasted for being, you have the people like Gwyneth Paltrow then who will just be ultra woke, and then you've got the ultra right as well.
This is, because part of the problem is a misunderstanding of this whole concept of identity politics.
Sure.
Where was that coming from? It came from women. They were feminists and they were and gay women. And the whole idea is it's almost a way of saying my life matters. I exist. That's what identity politics was about. It was not trying to separate one from another, say I exist at your cost.
Yes. And I mean, that also brings on to the all lives matter, where it all sounds very benign in the beginning, but it's like the big expression is, I've got a broken arm, but all bones matter. It's like, well, look, this is what Black lives matter. We have to really respect that.
Exactly. We have to respect Black lives and gay lives and trans lives and
anyone that's marginalized.
We have to respect life. But we're a human community, David.
There's an interesting thing that happened, though, there recently here, which also seems to be kind of swinging the other side of the spectrum, where there were meetings organized by the UNEF Students' Union here in France that were barring white people from coming to their meetings in case they would fuel tensions there, or that people, yet again, you mentioned the word identity politics, is going to be a key issue in the campaign coming up into the 2022 elections here in France. Now, what exactly, there was Audrey Pulvar, who was one of the Socialist Party candidates, was saying that the meetings should be barred, white people should be barred from these meetings, but no one should be excluded. It sounds a little bit like doublespeak again. Nobody should be excluded. As long, it's been put forward that these meetings in the Students' Union were support groups, and that if white people's presence were there, it would affect people's honesty in trying to express their experiences of discrimination, etc. So, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, look.
Is this just something that it's just another thing that has to be worked on? Is it?
It is another thing that has to be worked on because one of the things that we sort of have the political correct police that are always hovering around, ready to grab onto a piece of an idea in order to take the attention away from what the real problem is. It's
blindsiding is what you think.
It's blindsiding. It becomes these false equivalencies, these false narratives. They begin and they begin to happen. And then what happens is it creates a state of defensiveness, and then that creates the problem where the Eric Zemmours of the world can come forward and say, "Aha! You see, that's how all of them are," and it self-perpetuates.
It
self-perpetuates, and then it sends it sends Mr. Welbeck off to his typewriter, to his computer to write and
gets the thing sold. Well, now I mean we're talking here the one of our hooks today and meeting today, and just revisiting the problems with race in America, but also the repercussions here in France. When the George Floyd video, as you quite eloquently put when we were speaking off camera earlier, that was filmed by a 9-year-old child who obviously has no intentions, no ulterior motives for filming it. When George Floyd hit the headlines, when it got around social media, there were massive anti-racism protests here in Paris. Some of the protesters, the people coming out there of very mixed ethnicity. They were white, black, Arab, you name it. They said that George Floyd was the straw that broke the camel's back in the United States. They said, but here in France, it's different though. Similar situation, colonial state here, but that the police violence occurs against black and Arabs. We're the descendants of migrants, but a lot of the people who turned up to these protests, they're not from the banlieue. These would be educated people. So the people who are really suffering the brunt of, let's just say, the brutalities, etc., living out in where the great film La Haine was filmed at Mantes-la-Jolie, they're not the people who get on the RER to come out and shout for racial justice and anti-discrimination policies. So do you think it's kind of, what is it about the George Floyd images, do you think, that really mobilized people here in France?
Well, part of it is I think that George Floyd, that event and the subsequent trial, is a moment of reckoning for all of the injustices that have been forced on people of color, going back centuries, David. And I
mean, here in France, they latched on to the case of Adama Traore, who was a 24-year-old kid who they call the French George Floyd.
Here's how it's connected for me. The George Floyd moment was not an equivocal moment. It was clear, and it wasn't a moment of somebody trying to profit from this. This is, I think she was 17 years old. This is a 17-year-old girl with her little 9-year-old cousin who stops and looks this man in the eye. I mean, the courage of this girl. And she takes out her smartphone and she films this 9-minute and 40-something second event. And she does not move from this. She films this horror. The kid across the street who took the counterfeit $20 thing, calls his mother and says, "Mom, don't come downstairs. I don't want you to see what's going on." Yeah. This was a pure. This was not a criminal running or any of the other kinds of things
he was a dealer,
that we see in cinema. And cinema has sort of desensitized us to these kinds of things. This was a raw human moment of a man having the life squeezed out of him gratuitously. Yeah. With a cop with his sunglasses on the top of his head and one hand in his pocket and looking at a kid and saying to her, "You see, this is what happens when you do drugs."
Well, with the case of Adama Traore, indeed, he died in police custody, was pinned to the floor. There were various conflicting investigations about whether he was asphyxiated or, again, what is happening in the trial of Derek Chauvin, the police officer, about, he had maybe underlying health issues and problems. But I'm not trying to banalize George Floyd's death in any way, but I mean, these brutalities, these types of killings, especially now with the cop cams that are mandatory, I think, in most states in America, and also here in France, what made George Floyd, I was in the US in 1992 when Rodney King, the riots broke out in Los Angeles, and the same tensions were felt in cities on the East Coast where I was at the time. What happened between Rodney King's death when he was pulled from that truck back in 1992 and George Floyd's killing in 2020? In those 28 years, what happened?
The lens has sharpened. The lens is clear. It's clear. Rodney King, that was fuzzy. We're not sure. And so, and there's always this idea, the police stopped him. He must have been doing something wrong. If he wasn't doing something wrong, if there was no suspicion, he wouldn't have been stopped. We've been ingrained to think this way. George Floyd was clear. The guy says he's standing against the wall. He's not resisting. He's sitting down. He's not resisting. He's resisting getting into the cop car because he's telling them, "Don't do this. I'm claustrophobic." And when they take him out of the car to throw him on the ground, he says, "Thank you." Oh, thank you, because I'm claustrophobic. He had no idea what was coming next. So there's no equivocation, David. There are no more excuses. All the excuses have been used up.
But institutionally, were there any changes in the last 28 years between the brutality of 92?
No. But hopefully this will bring some things out. Some things have happened in this trial that are unprecedented. The police chief testifying against one of his officers. Police trainers and experts and this sort of thing. So there's that crack.
The code of silence has been broken.
It's broken. It's been broken. And this opens the door to another conversation about the role of police who are there to protect and serve. But again, I go back to this neoliberal construct. What are the police really here for? They're to protect and serve the property of the wealthy.
And that's it.
And to make sure that all the rest stay as far away as possible.
Well, on that bombshell, we're going to leave it for today. That was great to have you on Paris Perspective, Curtis Young. We'll be talking very soon again, I'm sure.
Thank you so much, David. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks.